All right, hey guys. So I had to take part in a training today, so I'm actually in the building here at Castleview. But you do have a sub, and that's Miss Sims, and we're doing a few things today. I thought you guys could just watch the Chapter 54 podcast here, and I'd make one for you. And then we have a couple assignments called the good, the bad, and the meh, and then also a food web assignment that's all attached in the packet that Miss Sims just gave to you. If you guys get done with this a little bit early, make sure that you focus on some questions. You do some reading in Chapter 54. You ask me any questions that you have about the material tomorrow, because remember, we're moving fast and we're sort of in boot camp here for the AP Bio exam. Okay, so the must-knows are listed right on top of that sheet that you have. Those are the things that we got to get through. Make sure that you're taking a look and you're really honing in and focusing on those things. So in the previous bit of content, what we were looking at was the level of populations. So we've looked at individual, excuse me, which is based on behavior, populations, which is interactions about growth, and the community is a bunch of populations working together. So here's our definition and a good example. When we look at community ecology, we're looking at a group of populations of different species living closely enough in a given area in order to interact. So predator-prey relationships are a good example of community ecology and how organisms can actually interact with one another. What we've got here is a type of principle that I need you guys to know about for the exam. But first, what we should mention is the type of interactions that you can have in a community. So we can have interspecific interactions, which could be positive ones between species, so a plus, a negative one between species, or a neutral one in which it doesn't matter. So those include competition, predation, and symbiotic relationships. Interspecific competition, so competition between species, can be competition for resources. Especially when they're in short supply. So competition is a minus, a negative. It's negative for both organisms when they're interacting, but this actually leads to natural selection, and that gets to this thing called the competitive exclusion principle, which is what this image here is showing, in which we have some yellow birds. They're competing here for this resource, which is the bugs. These red birds come in, and they're also going to be competing for the same bugs, and over a certain period of time, red actually outtakes or outcompetes the yellow. And that's called the competitive exclusion principle. It states that when two species are actually vying for the same resource, eventually the one with the slight reproductive advantage is going to eliminate the other. And that's what we have going on here, or natural selection is what the competitive exclusion principle is. And that's something that you guys should certainly focus on. Along with that, every organism has some sort of specific job that it's going to do in its ecosystem or in its community, and that's called the fundamental niche or niche. Right, so that is the combination of potential occupied niches by the species, where the realized niche is just the portion of that fundamental niche that the species actually occupies. Right, so it's the one that it actually has. So we could have an overlap of a bunch of fundamental niches, but the one that it actually occupies is going to be called the realized niche. So the niche, again, is just the job an organism has specifically in its community. So it could be to be the top predator, in which that predator kind of limits the growth of the organisms below them. Right, and there's several examples of that. These are actually fairly straightforward, and at this point in the podcast, you guys would be well served to just go ahead and hop to the good, the bad, and the meh. There's a presentation that I have linked onto the class website. If you click on it, there's several YouTube videos that will pop up. Okay, watch those YouTube videos and fill out the interactions actually on the sheet. There's 4 categories that we can look at. You can look at a predation, which is a plus-minus interaction. You can look at parasitism, which is another plus-minus interaction between organisms. We can look at mutualism, which is a plus-plus, and commensalism, which is a +0. It's the meh side of symbiotic relationships. Okay, so all of that is in Chapter 54. If you have your book or your review books, go ahead and look through those 4 things. Watch the videos, and as you're watching the videos, see if you can't determine which is which. What are the relationships with each of them? And then we'll review that with each other tomorrow. Okay? The next thing that I really want to move on to and talk about is just a few things about energy and how organisms are going to interact in their communities. And this is something that we do need to discuss because it's good launching in Chapter 55 as well. We need to know what the word autotrophs mean. And those are organisms which can synthesize their own organic molecules from very simple organic substances. So the really good example that we have is plants that can photosynthesize. They can turn sunlight into organic forms of carbon, like G3P, which they can turn into sugars. Right? Those are autotrophs. They're self-feeding organisms. There's deep sea organisms that do this also, which can use sources like sulfur from vents, hot vents, thermal vents, in which they can do something similar. But those autotrophs are basically the first line of taking inorganic forms of carbon and using energy and trapping that energy in order to move up the food chain. Heterotrophs, sorry about that, guys. Heterotrophs are organisms that obtain their organic molecules through the consumption of other organisms. So they consume other living things that aren't plants, not things that don't, things that need organic compounds through the act of eating. So a bear eating a salmon is a good example, or this guy eating a cheeseburger. Those are things that obtain their organic molecules through the consumption of others. Okay? A consumer then is what we would call those things. It's an organism that ingests other organic matter that is living or recently killed, in which we can break those up into three distinct categories. There's herbivores, which is an organism that obtains energy from consuming plants and only plants. Carnivores are actually going to get it just through animal tissue or meat. And detrivores obtain their energy through dead or decaying matter, things like bacteria or fungi. We would call it detrivore. Which leads to this idea here that we have producers are always going to be our largest baseline. Why? Because they have the most available free energy. They're the only ones that can actually take energy from the sun and fix it into organic molecules. Primary consumers are then the things that are going to eat the producers. Secondary consumers eat the primary consumers. Secondary consumers eat the tertiary consumers, and so on. But this is typically as high as they'll go because there's a loss of energy as we go up this pyramid, right? There's also some feeding relationships that we could look at, in which we're looking at food chains versus food webs. Food chains just describe a transfer of energy from one organism to the other. So an arrow points to the consumers to indicate the flow of energy in the system. So here we've got energy ultimately coming from the sun. The producer level is grass, so the energy is going boop, and being photosynthesized here by the grass. The grasshopper is going to eat the grass, so the energy is now into the grasshopper. Remember, some of it gets lost as heat. Shrew eats the grasshopper, so it gets some of that available energy that was originally here. It's the secondary consumer, and then up to the tertiary consumer eats the secondary consumer. So ultimately that energy is coming from here, gets up to the top, but a lot of it is being lost through biological processes as we go. Each one of these levels we call a trophic level. It describes the level at which an organism feeds in the food chain or food web. Food webs are much, much, much more complex than food chains. They involve multiple interactions. They involve multiple food chains working together. Food webs are much more realistic of what we'd see in ecology. Prey often have more than one predator, and predators exploit abundant amount of resources, so they're going to have more than one prey. So you end up getting a complicated food web instead, and that's something that you should be able to trace out. Go ahead and look through this Antarctic food web and pause the video here for a second, and then I'll walk through with you maybe what a food chain would be in here in some of the trophic levels. Okay, so one of the trophic levels that we could actually look at here is the producer is going to be something down here like a phytoplankton, right? And then I'm looking at the area, the arrows of where these will actually point. So the phytoplankton is going to get eaten here by the krill, which would be our primary consumer. The secondary consumer would then be maybe a fish. The tertiary consumer would then be up to the leopard seal. And then the quaternary consumer is going to be the small-toothed whales right up top. So you can see the flow of energy happening here. Or we could trace it over to here, which go up to here, here, and here, and then over to here. So you could do all sorts of different levels here. Okay, so sunlight is the initial energy source for almost all communities, but energy transformation is never 100% efficient. Why is that? Well, a lot of that gets lost as heat, right? So energy moves through the ecosystem. Autotrophs are going to convert light energy into chemical energy. That's the process called photosynthesis. Energy is also lost by heat in cellular respiration and in metabolism. So a lot of this energy gets lost. It's used or lost, right? It gets transferred. So by the time we go from the sun, which is a ton of available energy, all the way down to something like a tertiary consumer, we've lost a lot of energy, which means that our food chains and our food webs can't be more than like 4 or 5 levels because there's just not enough available energy. It's also why we see producers being the biggest numbers, right? So ultimately, the take-home message here is only 10% of available energy is transferred from one trophic level to the next. Food chains are really, really short, 4 to 5, because a lot of that gets lost as heat, which we can see here in this diagram. Okay, that's where I'm going to stop here for today, guys. The video is really short, about 10 minutes. There's some notes there. What I'd like you to go through and do and really focus on is go ahead and take a look at the food web assignment now. there's two things I want you to focus on: the good, the bad, and the meh, which are the interactions in community ecology. And then look at the flow of energy. Be able to build food webs, predict what happens when you remove a specific organism. And we'll talk about all this stuff tomorrow, but go through those couple things and really try those for me. And read through chapter 54. Watch any of the supplementary videos that I have. I'll make a section that just says chapter 54 supplementary videos. Really focus on chapter 54 today. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you. This is a mandatory thing that I got to go to. But I will see you guys tomorrow, and we'll keep going here with AP Bio Bootcamp. Bring questions.